Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Avivia Studios, Home of Factory International. Thank you for spending this hour with us. It's a lovely sunny day outside. I know you want to be there or at Sister Sisters. It's playing tonight with Golf Rap, but we're here. This is a series of conversations we started last April with artists that we have an existing relationship with, and then moving into artists that we are making something for the near future. And it's really around protecting space for conversation, for nuance, and insisting dialogue when we live in a world right now that it's shutting everything down. And of course, today we have the incredible Kaneza Schaal, based in New York, works across opera, theater, and film. You're also a performer. It's the first time I saw you a couple of years ago. But Kaneza is also one of the co-directors of the Under the Radar Festival in New York that happens in January. And we've invited Kaneza here today with us, of course, to reflect and to spend time with us to unpack the many things that are happening in the US right now. I mean, we've been following from across the pond, things that some of it are very close to home. I'm originally from Singapore. I was telling Kaneza that my body is manufactured in censorship, growing up in that kind of context. And of course, US, always as the bastion of democracy and free speech. We're living in a world of irony right now. So, welcome, Kaneza. Thank you for spending this lovely evening with us. We're really, really excited to have you, to really reflect on, as an artist, where is your head at? I mean, the first thing we want to ask a lot of colleagues in the US, how are you? So I'm going to ask you, how are you, my dear?
Well, I'm very happy to be here with you and with all of you in this place that you all have built with extraordinary leadership. I landed on the tarmac and received these beautiful notes that Ki Hong sent over. And I thought to myself, I proposed this. I proposed a talk on censorship. That is utterly perverse. I texted some friends, they're like, what are you doing, Kaneza? So I am, I used to think that desire was the most important quality for an artist, and that talent was quite boring, and that talent, if anything, is like the ability to focus one's desire. But more and more, I think perversity, the willingness to bang your head against the same wall and bloody your head against the same wall again and again and expect different results, is actually a superpower that artists possess. So in that spirit, I'm okay.
Yay. No, I'm so glad you have said it in that way, because I think, when John and I started this series, it was exactly that, to lean into the imagination of artists and the power of artists to continue to insist about these spaces by which we can imagine otherwise. When every day, whether you turn on your phone, turn on the TV, whatever, it's telling you no, 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 no. And in some ways, as artists, this is where, also feeds into the theme of the festival this year, or at least how we're framing it, about dreaming differently, about, rising above the storm, about transcending what is really immediate in front of you, to be able to see a little bit further away because you can see a bit of the light in front of you. I'm only going to mention his name once, and that's it. When Trump took on the second term of his presidency, January, he was a busy bee, signing executive orders left, right, and center. And one of the things that impact very closely to art and artists is from defunding of the NEA to become the chairman of the Kennedy Center, to shutting down programs that is deemed woke. Anything that is of diversity is to be shut down, is to be removed because, it goes against certain gender ideology, certain whatever. I want to know, Kaneza, when all of this kind of happened, and my suspicion is that this has been going on in the background for a while now. I think that moment is really that location of the kind of world that we're at right now. So I want to know, as an artist, as a community of artists living and working and operating in the US, what do you make sense of this?
I am answering your question. I did a performance once in a courtyard in Vietnam, and it was a text from Nat Turner's confession speech, and I broke a bunch of plates to a Peggy Lee song, and the cultural police arrived towards the end of the performance. We actually made it through the performance. And the kinds of questions they had, why are you doing this? What's the purpose? Is it important? Why do you think it's important? Who is it for? Is this really what you think the people here want and need? These are questions that I've been asked my entire practice. And the way in the US that the market has always functioned as a model of censorship, as a exerting of cultural repression and cultural force, that has sometimes masked the flashier showings of force that we see now, but is a fundamental through line to how, I would say, censorship is enacted. And when we look at it in kind of a more global setting, you feel the long timeline, as you're pointing out. Today, apparently, a list is to be published, and some of the kind of nitty-gritty of how cultural institutions and foundations will be affected, actually by the end of the day in the US today, the kind of new list of the top target priorities will be delivered, and cultural institutions will have been in their kind of war room scenario plannings, will begin laying out their plans. And I think there's kind of like 3 tracks in this next onslaught that people expect. One would be very intrusive, kind of mechanical interruption to the operations of cultural institutions and funding bodies, legal inquiries, et cetera. One would be kind of hot air congressional hearings to get the stories flying. And then one which a lot of the large foundations have been generously trying to prepare people for is target attacks on grantees in order to hold leadership's feet to the fire. So by the end of today and over the rest of this week, I think we'll see a new, very culture-oriented strategy rolling out from cultural institutions.
And for you,
Yes.
how are you bracing yourself with this quite a significant shift and change to I think the DNA and fabric,
Yeah.
of what makes America America,
I perversely, at my best, am more in love with Americans than I have ever been in the course of my life. Now, again, perversity, I come by it honest, and I told you I believe that is one of the superpowers of an artist. We were actually going to talk about this later, but I'm going there. There's in the midst of this horror show of chaos, there's a lot of really strange, cool economic policy around artists with deep bipartisan support that people are going to roll out pretty soon. Like, I would say more transformational legislation, specifically toward the performing arts, than we've seen in decades in the United States with bipartisan support. And the US is a really freaky, freaky country. And there are some social technologies and some bizarreness that excite me. That's a thread I'm not going to go down further, but to put out that there are some, in the midst of this, there's also this like creativity and ferocity on how to, even at the legislative level, be creative about how we think about sustainability and make changes that materially will affect artists' lives. So that's turning me on.
Great. I'm glad you really brought this in right early in our conversation, because I think in any kind of painting of this context, it's very easy and perhaps natural to go down to the doom and gloom side of things, because it just feels very helpless. And actually, if you look at it across history around the world, artists in societies of extreme persecution, the first thing people do, not just artists, but certain segments of society, is to be completely inventive, is to think about not necessarily only about survival per se, but that that we can kind of start to invent and create structures that can navigate this. I think the most recent one of recent memory was really in Argentina, that because of where the government is, and Jen, you know this, artists in the performing arts world kind of banded together to create this very special fund, a membership that you can subscribe, and they have an optimum of like 1,000 subscribers. And what this fund does is that people who subscribe it, artists who are part of this coalition, people get 2 free tickets to every performance that people put up. So in a way, it's also expanding and creating new audiences. But I'm just going to use this term right now because it's going to come later. But the kind of almost microfinancing that kind of emerges in order for artists to continue to navigate in the lack of, or in the massive shift of this kind of infrastructure that, of course, like we have been talking about, based on the kind of late capitalist economic kind of frameworks that justifies a lot of this kind of shift. So my next question, Kaneza, is really also, can you also share with us a little bit about the kinds of conversations that artists are also having in coffee shops, in bedrooms, and in corners and back alleys? Because I want to know the dirt. I want to know the kind of mini micro revolutions that people are plotting and planning.
I was recently talking with a friend who was working with me on a piece, and because of their vulnerabilities around status and political voice, they were being advised by everyone not to get on planes, because planes are the big checkpoints right now for subpoenas, for the various ways of intervening in any logical form of systematized justice and due process. And so this artist took a train for 20 hours in order to do a show with me. And we were talking about machetes. Machetes are a thing where my family comes from, and where a lot of people's family comes from. They're, not a good thing or a bad thing. They're just a thing. And when you start talking about machetes with people, the most horrible things come to people's minds. And it's as if people imagine that the blade of a machete is what kills people, and not the stories that wield that blade. And so with all of the very visible kind of violences being enacted by this administration, there's also the story logics that are being sent out and the threat that those stories pose in very material ways to people's lives. And so I think that is a lot of the story, that's a lot of the conversation that is harder to have in public, to be honest, that I think is happening. Also, you know, we were talking about this before, and again, it's this thing about the kind of the smoke and drama of this, not smoke, the like teeth and drama, like exquisite drama. I mean, come on, the like fist with the blood on the hand and the gunshot and the missed assassination, like that is high level theater wielding. But with all of that, pulling back to, you know, and the kind of, you were pointing out the kind of gender laws and just LGBTQ rights horror show that's being enacted right now. But when we pull back and we look at the way in which the US has horrifically enacted violence to any ideology around gender, violence to queer communities. You look at, say, kind of Uganda, that has some of the most atrocious, just like really hardcore, horrific gender laws in the world. Those were penned by the American Bible Belt, proudly. This is very well documented. This isn't like cool. I mean, it's insider because people don't talk about it, but it's like, it's very well documented. And this is a country that more than many, like, you know, Sappho, cover your ears, there is historical kind of evidence of queer leadership in Uganda, of women ruling and fucking women, more so than a lot of places in the world. And here we are in this like, oh, should we boycott Uganda because of their terrible gender laws? And it's like, no, that's the American Bible Belt expressing itself, and that's the US expressing the kind of suppression that it does in so many ways globally all the time, and has for a very long time, pointing us back to the long trajectory we're in, and this being a kind of explosion within the trajectory of visibility, but the actual force of all of that violence and all of that suppression and all of that censorship has absolutely been ongoing for such a long time. So I feel like these are some of the conversations that are happening in quieter spaces.
No, I think that's absolutely critical to be able to acknowledge and to articulate in these terms.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, what we see a lot, especially online, to, you know, a lot of the kind of more reactionary kind of protest type situations is very thin when it comes to the kind of logic of why people are doing it. And in fact, you know, to be able to articulate, acknowledge that actually this has been ongoing for quite a long time. And if you look at the history, there are also moments of it repeating. You know, the whole question of segregation, for example, I mean, we all seen, read, experienced it to some extent, but it's now coming back in all sorts of weird shapes and forms, you know.
I mean, I was doing pretty well the last couple months, but when that news came out of the white South Africans being granted refugee status, the kind of psychic warfare of that took me out for a day. That was the first time that I really got like taken out for a day and had to refill the perversity stocks to get back up and bang my head against the wall. But that, sitting on American soil, sitting on black farming history in the United States, that was one of those. That one got me. Like such a, you know, with all the things going on, for whatever reason, that was 24 hours of my life before I could get back up again.
And I'm glad that you're up and running after that. Can I go back to exactly how you started this, the question of perversity? It's something that excites me a lot because I think, reflecting also on my own practice, you know, working within government in Singapore, of course, when I first started, my friends were like, have you gone mad? Why have you joined the government, right? You're an artist, you know, all of that. And one of the first things I said was because I desperately wanted to know how government worked. Who is in the room making these decisions? As an academic, there was no access, no freaking way they would grant me an interview. So I did a better thing. I just joined the government. so that I could be right in the room with the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Finance, Prime Minister, all of that shebang, and know the kind of shit they talk about in decision room making. And understanding that kind of anxiety and logic that they also kind of, turn everything because, and actually for me, a lot of politicians are actually very simple. They are so basic, it's incredible. Their only interest in life is to maintain their hegemony, that they continue to rule, and that's it. Yeah? Politicians have forgotten that first and foremost, civil servants and actually all taxpayers, we are the bosses. But of course, everybody behaves like they're kings, queens, emperors, whatever, right? That's the perversity, I think, of kind of modern contemporary government structures that have really underpinned, I think, a lot of the bizarreness that we're observing globally, not just, not least in the US. Which is why I want to go back to the point of perversity. As an artist, you said perversity is probably the best superpower. I want to know, how are you wielding this perversity? Where is your head at in relation to your practice to kind of wield that power, and how can it manifest that more people can partake, can sit with, can be with this perversity?
In, I will say the name once also. In Trump's first administration, I was working on a piece that was thinking about migration and histories of belonging, and this sense that in the US, everyone, other than a very few, because the genocide was exceedingly effective, came from somewhere else. And so how do we, as we think about all of the kind of pressures in the world that are having more people moving than have ever been moving in the history of the world, how do we understand all of ourselves within that trajectory? So I was working on that project, and a bunch of like queer kids from Syria and El Salvador and all kinds of beautiful performers on that project. And we were doing the performance at the Kennedy Center, and we were doing it, the performances landed during the kind of government shutdown over building a wall. And there, at that time in DC, was a large influx of Salvadorian communities. And we had done a lot of work over many months to invite families who had recently arrived and to have them come to the show. And so we got to the first performance, and we were so excited. And like, there were weird things going on. Like, you couldn't touch the heat because the employees who deal with the heat were government employees, but the employees who, but the non-government employees could like handle the lights. So it was like really cold. There were just like bizarre things going on, but we banded together around, oh my God, we're literally talking about these ideas, and the government is shut down over a wall, and we have all these kids coming in to think with us, and all these kids also coming who, when they say where they're from, say we're from here, which is another story violence that gets enacted. And, we're not supposed to talk about children that way, but it's real. And that was kind of part of what we're trying to look at. So we get to the first night. 2 of the 35 families we had been in contact with showed up. And we were like, what? We did the work. Like, we did the work. We did the long-term work. We did the community work. We did the showing up work. We're like, only 2 people are here. What happened? And slowly, through like side conversations with some of the performers, particularly the performer who was from El Salvador, we learned that the families thought, wait, you're giving us free tickets to go to a government building? Hell no, that's a trap. Absolutely not. We're not sending our children into that building with your free tickets. And after the first performance, the understanding settled a little, word got out, people came in, and by the end, I think we got like 32 of the 36 families through by the end of the run. At the moment for me, and this relates to sports, we don't have to go there right now, but that is what excites me the most, is how people gather. And it's this perversity. It's like, how do we deal with who we are and how we're gathering in rooms and how we're talking to each other? That is where the joy of the question asking is for me. And, I'm now making opera, which is a really specific machinery that's, talk about perversity, that is very hard to think about who gets invited and how. But that's kind of one of the reasons I like doing it, is to bloody my head against that wall. So I think these questions around people gathering is where the fire on that lives for me, and always has always been troubled by by U.S. governmental logics. I mean, even in the other years, you were talking about dreaming, and it made me think about. I did a piece with an artist who I first saw perform when he was in prison. He was serving a 33-year sentence, and I come from experimental avant-garde downtown New York theater, and I saw this performance. I was like, oh my God, experimental what? Experimental who? He was playing Ma Rainey in full drag at an all-male correctional facility, and I was like, this is it. This is the work. This is all the traditions that I studied on the page enacted with a kind of ferocity that was out of control. So I found out he had gotten out. I tracked him down. I was like, hey, let's make some art together. And he's like, what, you want to pay me to act? Heck yes. So we worked on a piece together. We ended up not being able to premiere that piece because of his parole schedule. And so we had all this unfinished creative business, and what we got to was, okay, well, we're talking about dreaming. We're talking about dreaming, and the dreaming that the state takes, and the dreaming that the state continues to take even after you've served time. So how do you think about the metricsless damages of the prison industrial complex? Everybody's excited to measure things. Everybody's excited about the guilt-innocence dichotomies. How do we think about dreaming spaces? How do we think about the spaces you cannot measure? How do we think about the way the state keeps trying to get at our dreaming spaces, the way fascism wants to make everything about itself? How do we keep fighting for those imaginative landscapes? And so that was the other thing that really came up in perversity and in thinking about this glorious season you all are stepping into.
I'm glad you mentioned about assembly, and now more than ever, we have to, kind of rely on our belief in community, the belief in each other, the belief that actually together, we can protect these spaces of dreaming. Because in many ways, the kind of imagination, no amount of persecution, censorship, change of structures, defunding, all of that can actually take that away. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that this is possible actually on a daily basis. I think what the machine does is to make you forget that we can and allowed to dream. And I think, for us as a cultural institutions, it is so important that artists are right front and center to always articulate this, to always demonstrate, to always protect these kinds of spaces. Because, we engage in a space of live performance, doesn't matter what discipline, but that kind of assembly is where, leaving Hong Kong, for me, that became very difficult to see that gathering was made more and more impossible. And living in Singapore, there's actually a real law. When two or three of you gather, actually it's illegal. It's written in law that if, let's say, the three of us are hanging out, it is the right of the police to arrest us. I grew up with that kind of scenario, So in that sense, this kind of insisting, different ways of assembly in the quiet corners, in the dark alleys, that is where it's happening, I feel. And more maybe this kind of more visible protesting may not be the right strategy.
And organized protest has made so much tremendous change. So let me be very clear
Absolutely.
on what I'm saying.
Yeah.
However, the obsession with visibility that we live in right now, and the amount to which so many of our survivals has depended on technology that has not been visible, and decidedly so, in order to protect our survivals, I agree so much with what the dangers of this moment are, and these devices, wherever mine is, this quest to be seen, this quest to be looked at, this quest to have your selfhood acknowledged by an external power, versus all of the defining of ourselves and between ourselves, and the amount of just literal survival that has happened in that way. Is this being recorded? I can't remember. It's recorded, but it's chill? Okay. So then let's talk. So I've started working on an art center in Kigali, Rwanda. My father's family is from East Africa. And Rwanda is a place where media was the core tool of a genocide. So how ideas of freedom of speech function are really complicated and nuanced. And it is so easy for the cute academics in the US in their little offices to throw a lot of shade at Rwanda. Now, we can fight about Rwanda another time and leadership, etc. If anyone wants to, please, let's do that after this. Regardless of anyone's strong feelings about leadership in Rwanda and the current situation, the fact is, it's a very nuanced conversation. And nation building and media and the wellness of a whole body of humans is a really complicated math. And I am, perversely, so excited about articulating spaces of freedom in that context, and articulating freedoms that I feel denied in the US within that context. And thinking about, it's small but significant kind of multidisciplinary space. Thinking about artist gathering, thinking about libraries, structures of information moving between people, all of this gloriousness, and doing it in a very complicated context around nation building, media, and free speech. And the idea of ferociously defining freedom in that context feels to me like, in all of my perversity quests, one of the next ways to have the conversations that I really struggle to have in the United States. And I'm curious about that in your life and practice too. Like, are there, yeah, anyhow.
I'm here. and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to justify why I'm engaged in the arts, why we're engaging in artists who are articulate in really reflecting on what the world is about. It's the kind of space that for me, it's getting more and more, I would say, precious, that it's delicate, that it's vulnerable, that it's very easily taken away from us, because I've experienced, for reals, even the dark alleys are taken away from you. And then you have to find what other dark alleys are left, right? So for me, I'm glad to hear that your journey in working on this art center, I mean, she's incredible. She's done so many things, right? That it's giving you that space that you can't have in the US. And I think we should not be defined solely by by any particular context we exist in. Because first and foremost, we've always been intersectional. First and foremost, we've always existed as multiples in so many, many different ways. And I think with that, because I want time for you to talk about the two things I really want to talk about. One, this whole question of the microfinancing. because it's interesting that, back and forth, you brought that up of late, the kind of conversations you're having, because I think this is important, because it reminds us that we're never absolutely beholden to any current structures that we deem that we're operating within. So I want to unpack a bit more, what do you mean by that?
Maybe I'll start with this censorship lens. And I think one of the most terrifying, successful regimes in the empire of the United States has been economic censorship and economic repression. Conversely, some of the most effective, badass things that happen in the US relate to people bringing forms of communal finance thinking and surviving the US infrastructure through those forms. Chinatown in New York City and in San Francisco, great example. Microfinance logics fully defining generations of wealth, freedom, intellectual, creative development. Throughout the United States, West African hair braiding salons, the susu, the West African susu model, being an entrepreneurial logic that, like so many braiding salons, that ends up in like tangible ownership often, and sustainability and kind of generative. Also, let us talk about the performance of braiding, and if we're going to protect performance, how do we protect these critical creative knowledge bases and tools and performance activities? Point being, microfinance structures that have everything to do with how the success and proliferation and protection of braiding in the US. And if we think about the shoulders that all of us in the United States stand on, which is the genius of Black American production, Black American thought and practice, that we all stand on in the United States. You look at you see some of the most aggressive examples of censorship. You take the Oklahoma and the whole kind of Black Wall Street and the just literal bombing of all that infrastructure, because it worked. Because when people get together and share money and do stuff with it, like, it really works. You think about the Panthers and kind of free breakfast programs and all of the microfinance logics that were going on with the Panthers and the systematic destruction and of the infrastructures that were being built. And there are a few, in terms of like the conversations behind the doors, some of the people who've been some of the organizers and kind of microfinance thinkers who've been really standing on the shoulders of the Panthers and who cross into kind of cultural sectors, there's not the data yet. Maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, enough dust will have settled that people can figure out how things happen. But recently, someone's house burnt down, not from a global warming fire, and then their place of office and of organizing burnt down the next day. There's nothing yet to identify how that happened, but it sure smells of the kind of history of repression around economic innovation and collaboration between the many. So with all of that in mind, I think the fact is the finance technologies that have chipped away at imperial structures globally work. And they work in the US too, even if they have been really strategically undermined. And I think that artists at our best, We are often working in resources that are not money. We are so rich in the resources we work in, and it is very hard in the face of the culture in the United States to build kind of sustainable models of pooling money between people. And I think that is in part because to do that in the US, there's kind of a rendering legible of the structures you're building. And once you start doing that, you've already broke the most important technology to begin with. And this is a place where my head is so bloodied because I made a big old experiment with a bunch of people, and I thought it would make them, I thought it would make all of us, then especially the younger artists, start doing it for each other and with themselves, and it didn't. And like, I'm still nursing my broken heart on what it meant to have to render those structures legible, and then the inherent corrosion of the actual technology that allows us to organize between ourselves, which is much more related to going and having a beer or sipping tea. You know, Patrice Lumumba sold beer. It's not that, it's like the great man, let us get rid of it. It is not where the power is. He was assassinated before he could fail. Look, I said it, it's being recorded. I said it, he was assassinated before he could fail. The great man has got to go, but Patrice Lumumba sold beer. And so people got together around tables and drank beer and talked to each other. That, to me, is the greatness. And that's the greatness of theater, and that's the greatness of us all being together today. So I guess when it comes to microfinance, my real struggle is how do we do it without having to render everything legible to others? Because I think that, to institutional logics, because I think that kills it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you really, really pointed at, that also reimagination of structures and institutions, because, it's interesting because for the life of me, I've always been very curious about secret societies living in Hong Kong because they're like so famous, and it's very hard to get access to it. And that is precisely perhaps why it kind of worked. I mean, like the mob and all of that. I mean, like, historically over societies, it works because they work in secret. Yeah, you have so many different examples across the world, and that secrecy kind of makes sense because it kind of operates in the realms outside, in between, above, under anything that what you talked about earlier that is legible. And things that are not legible is perhaps for me that kind of perverse superpower that we need to continue to invent. We need to continue to, at one point I used the word queering in order to do that. Really how, in the underground Vogue Bowl, they've created their own structures, from, realness, from superfine and all of that. It's because it kind of rises above, goes under, in and around, like liquid. And in Hong Kong, of course, we borrowed from Bruce Lee, be water, because you just do this, and then it emerges into something else. And that's where it's hard to, for the powers that be to kind of navigate that. So I really like your point around this question about rethinking economic structures, but I think you've also touched upon how art is, through storytelling essentially, that you allow this to propagate, to expand, and for people to take up the mantle. I want to shift a little bit to this other point that you kind of briefly mentioned, this whole question about sports. Where is your head with that? Because you came in, and the first thing you said, damn it, this summer you're going to do a big exhibition around football and art.
It was less damn it. It was more like, the damn it was like, why does everybody have to be so behind Factory International? Why do you have to be ahead all the time? Because, all right, let's be patriotic for a moment. I am not actually that interested in the form of democracy that the Greeks started. I think there are way more exciting models that come from the continent that actually could save humanity. But let us accept that form is the form we've all said we're going to practice. Okay. These people, they put their theaters and their sporting arenas next to where people voted. And that's human technology realness. I don't know if anyone ever read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone? It's like, he's like a sociologist, and he's like, oh, America's gonna fall apart, and the thing that could save America is if everybody joined a bowling club. Because you need to spend time, you need to spend time with people who are just a little different than you. Maybe they buy different lettuce than you buy. Maybe they park their car in a different parking lot than you buy. But like, we have to spend time together. Like, the functioning of democracy is based on humans spending time together. And so everybody should join a bowling club. But I really do think that that as a performance maker, I work in literally a form that disappears. Like, I work in technology between people that is not visible. Like, I deeply believe in that, and I deeply believe that voting has to do with all the technologies that sporting arenas deal with and that theaters deal with, and that we're really good at, and honestly, that sporting arenas do some things way better than we do. Currently in the theater, like, just the over-regulatedness of how we gather in theaters is becoming so tiresome. It's just, and the level of disinvitation that is baked into that. Okay, sports. So one of the places I've been spending a lot of time lately is opera houses, perversity. And one of the fascinating things about opera houses is there's been like municipal thought that has gone into their locations, and often they're actually close to sporting arenas in many cities, or in many cities. And also, strangely, opera houses are one of the few places where people with different political ideologies spend time together anymore in the US. Like, opera houses and airports, I feel like, are the places where people who voted differently actually end up in physical space together. And that is curious to me. And then the level of insane disinvitation and I swear to God, I'm getting there. And the kind of inherent classism in how all cultural institutions talk about audiences. Like, so in Detroit Opera, for example, the Opera House is literally across the street from Fox Field, which is a big kind of baseball field. And you'll see, like there'll be a monster truck rally, and you'll see families of 5 going to spend the entire day together at this monster truck rally, and spending more money for their nosebleed-ass seats in the bleachers than an orchestra ticket in the opera house across the street. So get out of my face with people who work hard don't want to spend their money on, like, cultural exchange and leisure. You know what I mean? Like, just stop. Just stop that noise, cultural institutions. It's not true. And so then what are all the other architectures of disinvitation that are dividing these audiences? And on the perversity tip and on the America gives me joy still tip, I want the sports fans and the opera fans to, like, hang out together and talk about stuff, because we'll have way better conversations if that happens. So I've been trying to get opera singers to talk to athletes, also because people who work in, like, high-level physical output, oh my God, how cool to have craft singers, but craft conversations between exquisite singers and exquisite athletes. I also played basketball. So that's been so exciting to me. And when I tell you, Ki-hung, I bring this to the boys, and the boys who I get along with, they can't. The opera boys cannot with me on the sports thing. They really, like, that is where they draw the line. I push them in a lot of ways. They'll do a lot of crazy stuff. They'll, like, get all the mosques activated to come out to the theater. They'll do all kinds of crazy stuff. But this sports thing, they're like, I can't with you. I actually can't with you right now. And so that is when I walked in this building. I was like, honestly, what it is I'm just going to point people to this, of, like, catch TF up. Like, we have to talk to each other. We have to spend time with each other. You know, one of the things I've been saying lately is, with global warming, we are headed to some severe times. So if I were driving in West Virginia in the United States and my car broke down and I had a flat tire, I can't believe I'm saying this on camera. I bet that 7 out of 10 trucks with a Confederate flag on the back would fix my tire. I grew up in Northern California, so I can say this. 10 out of 10 cars in Northern California would drive by. They would roll down their window. They would say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Good luck. I hope you have AAA." And they would drive by. And we are headed into tire fixing times. And the stories that are circulating in the US stand to break that fabric in the US, which is the shred of patriotism or perversity that I still hold on to. And that is what scares me the most, is that the stories we're trucking in could break that thing. And when that thing breaks in the US, it's a wrap. Yeah. It's a wrap when that breaks. Yeah. But I really believe that. And that is why I want athletes and opera singers to talk to each other. And I'm so excited. Like, I was walking down the street and people were singing. Like, I was with Jim, we were walking down the street, people were singing. The footballers were singing. I was like, we don't get people to sing in the opera that often, not with that amount of gusto. Like, what are we doing wrong? You know what I mean? And for you to kind of get all of that technology to touch each other, that's where transformation lives. And so I'm excited for y'all. And I want in.
Absolutely, Kaneza. You're here, you're back for the festival, so definitely you get to kind of, be in the midst of it. But I think what you just said, is really so critical. To not forget that actually, the lines of divide, it's constructed elsewhere. It's constructed by somebody else. That in the day-to-day, in the human-to-human, like you say, right? The trucks driving, with the Confederate flag will stop and help. In this other dismantling, is precisely retelling the story to all of us that the divide needs to be there. Yeah. Because that is what will crumble, I think, the fabric of society. Because, like I say, it's really about people meeting people, eye to eye, person to person, regardless of ideologies, whatever beliefs, and so on and so forth. We can still meet each other as people. And I think that's the kind of fundamental that I feel as artists in the storytelling, we have to continue to insist. We have to continue to always retell. Everyone, the brilliant Kaneza. Thank you very much for this incredible hour with you, with us together. That you've challenged us to think in so many different ways. To be perverse, that's the T-shirt of the day. Be perverse, that's our superpower. I'm going to talk back as well. So I just want to thank you again for being here with us, and we hope to see you during the festival at some point in the near future. We will experience the work of Kaneza. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely, lovely evening.